He thought it was a drunk behind the hay bales, someone curled up against the cold, breathing shallow, wrapped in an oil-stiff coat. The thought lasted all of 2 seconds. At 3:22 a.m., with the clinic's neon sign breathing against the black, Dr. James Mitchell shouldered the metal gate and stepped into a smell of earth and hay and something sweeter, like ozone after lightning. What he found did not fit any chart he'd ever studied. The body was pale in a way that made color feel like an afterthought. The face, when he turned it toward the light, carried no obvious human scar pattern. Smooth skin that gave under his fingertips, but not like tissue bruising. A warmth that was less than life and more than cold. The hands that lay against the belly were too long, knuckles tapering into fingers that ended not bluntly but slightly pointed, as if shaped for a different gravity. The clothing, if it could be called that, was a single sheet of fabric that folded and separated like wet paper, clinging in places, lifting in others as if resisting definition. There was a thin residue on the palms, almost crystalline, and a faint odor James couldn't place, half metal, half fresh rain. He had answers for these moments, measurable things he could do. He checked pulse, then listened with a stethoscope that had been clipped to his chest for 20 years, more as habit than necessity. The rhythm was uneven, but present. He pried open the stranger's eyelids. The irises were deep, reflective, darker than a human's, and when the pupils narrowed, James felt a childish, irrational disappointment that the eyes were not black holes. They were not human in the way he had known people, but the chest still rose. That answered panic with purpose. He dressed the patient in a clean sheet and carried him into the fluorescent honesty of the clinic. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and coffee and the faint, ever-present animal musk of a veterinarian's life. He set him on an exam table, cleared space for instruments, and in the quiet between hand movements, he realized how his hands trembled. Not precisely from fear, but from the tightness in his chest he had learned to expect overnight. The old autoimmune flare he could keep at bay most days, but which surfaced when sleep was thin and adrenaline long. He swallowed the thought and got to work. The wounds were the first real mystery. There were tears along the torso, shallow as abrasions, yet the skin beneath shimmered like the inside of a cut opal. When James cleaned the edges with saline, the solution misted and smoked on contact, a fine vapor that smelled faintly of copper. He had seen burns react oddly before, chemical necrosis in milking parlors when cows chewed frozen wire, frostbite where tissue separated in bright crystalline lines, but nothing behaved like this. The tissue did not blacken, it closed. The margins reapproximated in minutes, puckering like a shoelace pulled tight. He sutured, because suturing felt like doing something, and the thread went through skin that resisted, opting for smoothness rather than screaming open. The stranger woke somewhere between the second and fourth stitch. His eyes opened on James, and there was a beat so dense it tasted like iron. The man, I kept calling him that because names make things manageable, spoke then, and the voice came, not spoken alone, but as thought folded into sound. Listen, I am not what you think. It was not a memory or an echo. It dropped into James's head like a cool hand on a fevered brow, and stayed there, clear, carrying an accentless cadence and an insistence that made speech unnecessary. He recoiled from the intimacy. He told himself aloud to stop indulging in whatever hallucination this was. The stress from the morgue call, the feint of sleep, the holiday nights grown long with loneliness. But the thought was not his own. The stranger watched him with something like amusement and relief. "You're afraid," the voice said, and James realized the stranger's lips had not moved. The sound, when it came through the throat, matched the interior voice, but was less complete than what he had heard inside. The interior voice carried an emotional thread, unfamiliar kindness, so that even when the content was unfamiliar, its tone felt like home. "You're hurt," came the next thought. It landed in James's chest like a diagnostic note, and then unfurled as an instruction, "Show me water." James found himself obeying. He wetted a gauze and lifted it to the stranger's temples. The skin absorbed the moisture as if thirsty. It did not drink like human tissue, it accepted like a sponge. When the residue dissolved, the gauze came away with a faint iridescence. He had been a veterinarian since his 20s, a student of animal bodies first, and then of the fragile human heart that kept breaking his long days open. There were rhythms he trusted: checks, vitals, measures, the long catalog of biology's blunt answers. This did not fit in the usual catalog. Yet the simplest clinical impulses, support airway, preserve warmth, prevent infection, applied. He placed the stranger on warmed pads, adjusted oxygen out of pure habit, though the chest seemed to take air without complaint, and made notes with a pencil that felt suddenly archaic in his hand. Outside, the town of Cedar Falls slept like a breathing farm. He thought of the house he had left hours earlier. Empty rooms, a bed that held the shape of one more person he used to share it with before the divorce, a framed photograph on the kitchen counter of a younger James with a scholarship in his pocket and a future that had assumed stability. He thought of the clinic's roof, its single light that lit the county road when snow came and the tractors when harvest ran late. He thought of the autoimmune diagnosis 3 years before, the tremor in his fingers, the nights he shook under quilts, the pills he took and hid from neighbors. He thought of being trained to measure things that could be measured and to act on the rest. By dawn, James had given the stranger electrolytes and tetanus serum prophylaxis on instinct. He had bandaged the crystalline edge's wounds, set up an IV, because in the first hour, when the body is not yet telling its story, a line into the vein feels like an anchor. He had X-rayed out of professional habit, limbs intact, no fractures, but a fine opalescent dust showed faintly on the images as a luminescent haze around the thorax. He had photographed everything with a Polaroid because the somatic logic of his brain insisted on visual proof. The patient slept between stitches, his breath kept a rhythm that did not tremble. When the stranger finally spoke with words, James listened with a surgeon's patience. "James," he said, "my name is Cale." James remembered later that he had laughed a little then, a dry sound that ached. He had no right to laughter. He patched the IV and wrote the name down, Cale Mitchell, visitor, unknown origin, on a pad that would later become a ledger of impossibilities. In the small hours before light creased the eastern sky, Cale did not ask for food or shelter. He did not ask for money. The request was simpler and stranger. "Can you let me rest?" he said, and the thought pressed against James like a small child holding out a hand. "Listen." James sat by the table with a coffee gone cold, watching the rise and fall of a chest that did not belong in his taxonomy. He should have called someone, authorities, the university, a doctor with more contacts than he had, yet he found himself thinking of all the animals that came through his clinic in the dead hour. A mare with a hoof split open in winter, a litter of piglets born into a storm, a stray collie with lungs full of fungus and a face that recognized humans even when they were lightless. He had been trained to be alone with suffering because often that was what saving looked like on a farm. That morning, before the light fully came, before the town's first pickup rattled past and the school buses filled the air an hour later, James wrote in his diary, because he always wrote things down. He wrote with a hand that trembled in a way that rumor or fatigue could not explain. The entry read like both confession and record. "I found him behind the hay bales at 3:22 a.m. If anyone asks, I will say I brought him here to stabilize him. I do not know what else to say. He is not human in form, but his chest rises. He said his name is Cale. He spoke in my head before he spoke aloud. I cannot explain that. I will not yet call anyone. I will watch and record." The act of writing steadied him. He taped the page into the ledger and then made a list. Vitals, wound care, observations, and then, as if reluctantly, the one line that would change the arc of his life. Telepathic contact, unverified, subjective. He underlined it twice, same way he had underlined notes about equine anesthesia and special diets in vet school. By day 2, the stranger was coherent enough to eat, and that coherence revealed other oddities. Cale moved with the economy of someone who had not needed to account for upright walking. His gait was slightly amphibious, using balance over hips rather than the human knee's articulate architecture. He was fascinated by the clinic's instruments with a child's curiosity. He touched a stethoscope, and his fingers left no fingerprints. He ran a hand along a shelf of jars and asked what each contained. He watched James as a scientist watches a specimen, and then as if watching a fellow traveler try to remember a map. "You healed animals," he said at one point. Voice a small sound that arrived in James' mind that way a photograph arrives in a darkroom. "You know touch. That matters." James bristled at the assumption, as if the small animal rescues and emergency surgeries he'd performed were proof of nobility, but he nodded because conversation felt like a tether to ordinary life. "I mend what I can," he said aloud. "I don't have answers for what you are." Cale's thought came then, and it was less a sentence than an offering. "You may not have language for what I am, but listen to what I can show you." He demonstrated small things first. Not miracles by James' measurement, no resurrections on the table, but subtle shifts the way a patient notices when a fever breaks. A wound that had been redder at noon seemed less tight by evening. A bandage dampened by a mist that smelled faintly of rain. He taught James a way to sit that quieted a tremor in the hand, an alignment of breath and focus that felt like a mental triage, attention, directed breath, and an image of letting go. He called it a clearing, and at first James treated it as a meditation being performed in a clinic because no one else was there to watch. 3 long inhales, a soft exhale, the mind focusing on a point behind the sternum that hummed like a tuning fork. When James tried it, the tremor slowed, not because the body was magically cured, but because the tightness in his chest loosened and he could write without the ink blotting his hand. Cale explained little in the way of didactic lectures. He used metaphors James could picture. "Consciousness is like a tool," he said once, and the phrase lodged in James' skull like a splinter. "It holds shape if you place it. Jesus used his attention to change the world, as a craftsman uses a chisel. It's a technology, James, not a miracle you cannot learn." James' throat closed around the theological implications. He had been raised in Sunday school, had memorized passages, had stood at altars with heads bowed. The suggestion that Jesus' acts could be taught, reframed as techniques rather than divine singularities, felt like sacrilege to his training. Yet the suggestion was Cale's, offered with humility, as if the idea had been collected and passed forward, not pronounced with doctrine. "That's a dangerous framing," James said, not because he was trying to argue then, but because he needed to see whether the stranger would press. To say it was technique rather than faith, people will hear that as a negation. Cale's answer came quiet and careful. "I do not correct belief. I show function. People have used many words for what they experience. Labels belong to those who keep them. What matters is what a person can do to bring health and compassion into a broken place." The 3-day pattern began to reveal itself like the rings of a tree, each day adding a layer of texture. On the first day, James took stock and patched wounds. On the second day, he watched the stranger move and test instruments and ask questions about animal physiology that made James sit up and check the way he explained the pulmonary valve. On the third day, Cale invited James to place a hand on the stranger's chest, to feel a warmth not in heat but in a pressure of intent. "When you focus, you will notice a line," Cale transmitted, and James' heart answered. The line was not visible, but he felt it, a thin current threading from his palm into the stranger's torso. It pulsed with an odd steadiness, like a metronome. "Let it flow like your own heartbeat, not trying to fix, but to witness," Cale said. "The body responds to attention." James, who had performed surgeries through floodlight and code and dying animals under snow, thought then of the countless times he had placed hands on creatures and prayed a private, blunt prayer.
He thought of old farmers who blessed a cow as if naming it would change its luck. He thought of the ritual of touch in his profession, the cradling of a newborn foal, the firm hand pressed to a bleeding flank. He placed his palm on Cale's sternum because it was the next logical step in the sequence of events. He felt the pulse of the stranger as a presence more than a beat, a pattern that answered to his own breath. When he exhaled deliberately, as Cale had instructed, he felt the line loosen. When he inhaled and imagined a light like a small sun in his chest, the line responded with a subtle brightening. It was not dramatic, there was no immediate fix. But the bandage on Cale's side, when James checked it minutes later, showed new edges sliding together as if tension in the skin had eased. Those small changes would have been enough to keep them awake on their own. But word began to travel in the local way rural towns have, through a neighbor at the feed store, through a woman who supplied hay who came into the clinic to pick up an invoice and noticed the stranger in the corner, through Tom Morrison, who had found James behind the hay bales in the first place, and who now, like everyone else in a county of farms, had a story to tell 2 days later when the unusual stallion down the road stopped eating and no one could get it up. Tom showed up in the space between awe and practical need, a man shaped by tractors and weather, hands like knots, eyes that watched the world as if calculating risk. He and James had been in and out of each other's business for decades. Tom brought his cattle to the clinic. James had delivered more of Tom's calves than he could name. Tom stood just inside the door, hat clutched to his chest. The clinic smelled like damp hay and antiseptic, and now the low tang of fear that belongs in a man who has seen animals die. "They brought her in this morning," Tom said, voice low. "Bell's down. Vet out there said she won't stand. We can't afford to lose her, Jin. She fetches us more than we earn in a year." James told Tom to breathe, to speak slowly. He felt the old instincts click, triage, assess, act. And he felt something else beneath them, the reluctant curiosity of a scientist met with the possibility of something beyond his models. He thought of Cale sleeping on the exam table under a blanket, a figure of foreign geometry whose presence had shifted the axis of the clinic into an eccentric new orbit. Tom stood and stared at Cale, skepticism folded into every twitch of his jaw. "You going to help us with Bell?" he asked, and the word help held a country code of expectation. Treat, pull through, to save. He looked to James for a promise. James looked back at Cale, then at the mare in Tom's small truck out by the barn camera they'd used to check animals remotely. He felt the weight of the county's farm economy pressing on his shoulders like wet wool. Cale rose slowly, as if he had slept too long and were rearranging limbs. He did not touch the word miracle. He did not make promises. He only said, in the quiet way he had, "I can show how to tune what is already here." They drove out in a truck that smelled of diesel and old coffee. The clinic's fluorescent lights fell behind them like a memory as the road carried them towards Tom's barn. Weather turned the world monochrome, sky the color of old dishwater, fields wrapped in frost. Belle lay in her stall on a bed of straw, flank heaving, nostrils flared, eyes glazed in that way illness makes kin to the sea. Her flank was hot when James slipped his hand beneath the blanket. He felt the severity of it, fever, maybe colic, maybe dehydration compounded by a body that had been lying for hours. James did what he knew. He assessed, listened, rectified where he could. He ran his hand along the mare's flank and found the gut distended. He put on gloves, administered fluids, inserted a nasogastric tube, because the horse had been down too long and swallowing could not be trusted. Beside him, Cale moved with the calm of someone who had watched life unfold in many patterns. He did not hurry. He did not speak. He placed a hand on the mare's shoulder and closed his eyes for a long moment. "What are you doing?" Tom asked, breath clouding in the cold. Cale's voice appeared inside James's mind like the memory of a bell. A line. Witness. Let go. James worked while the truck heater hummed. He kept doing the practical work because the body required it. He kept thinking of the way Cale had said Jesus used attention as a technique, and felt both defensive and secretly hungry for method. He had been a man of methods for a long time: diagnoses, sutures, medications. The idea that another method could be added to the tool belt did not make the other methods false, it simply made his inventory larger. He watched as something subtle unfolded. Belle's ears flicked. The color returned to her mucous membranes a few shades. She tried to roll, and James steadied her shoulder, expecting the worst. Fog like a cloud washed his vision for a moment. He blamed exhaustion. And when it cleared, he saw Belle push herself up on forelegs, then rear in a way that startled them both. Tom swore and laughed and cried in a sentence. Belle nosed at the hay and ate. The change was not an immediate cure for whatever had ailed her. There would be checks, fluids, observation, careful days ahead. But the mare that should have stayed down until a vet with more equipment arrived was standing with a willingness he had not seen earlier. The look she gave Tom was not of miraculous awakening, but of animal awareness returning, a thing that seemed to belong to the category of how animals know to keep living, rather than the human category labeled miracle. Word spread in the small town with the speed of coffee talk and prayer. A neighbor stopped by with a tin of cookies. A woman from the church came with a casserole, and they all stood in the clinic doorway and whispered about what had happened to Belle. None of it was measured science in a lab, but it fit into a different kind of evidence: witness testimony, carried in the form of calls, visits, a neighbor's worried questions that came like a chorus. The second day, Dr. Richard Stevens, a pulmonologist from the regional hospital 30 miles away, who liked to call himself practical, showed up. James had called him in the morning with the thinness of a man who needed counsel more than assistance. Richard arrived with a folder of skepticism like an umbrella, eyes that read as both curiosity and mild irritation. He walked into the exam room, took in Cale, took in James, and raised one eyebrow. "You saying you did what now?" he asked. "You patched him up and meditated?" James felt himself explain and justify, because he had the habit of accounting for things in clinical terms.
"I stabilized him. There was telepathic contact, subjective. He taught a breathing alignment and a focus technique. We used it in conjunction with standard care. We kept fluids, monitored electrolytes. Belle responded within hours." Richard's reply was a dry laugh. "Placebo," he said. "Horses get better. Maybe the tide turned. Or maybe she would have gotten up without. Maybe," James cut in, "not to be defensive, but because the word felt like a dodge. Or maybe there are things we can add to the tool set that we don't teach in school." Richard's face softened when he saw the ledger of photographs, the Polaroids, the vital charts. "I'm not saying there's a cosmic trick here," he said carefully, "but I also know a phenomenon when I see one. Document everything, Jim. If you're going to keep exploring this, be methodical. Don't let your notes get poetic. Keep labs, blood work, objective data. If there's anything to see here, we should be able to measure it." James found in Richard's words the authority he needed and the caution he appreciated. He promised to catalog everything, to do blood draws, to set up controls where he could. He felt the half-cool comfort of someone in white willing to insist on numbers. It kept him tethered to his profession in a way that Cale's language did not. That night at the clinic, when the town settled into a hush that felt like an unspooling breath, James sat at his desk and read through Cale's possessions. There were no ID cards, no passports, nothing that could be fingerprinted for an origin. A small object, no larger than a coin, sat on the tray. Flat, metallic, with a pattern like a labyrinth carved into its face. Cale had let James examine it earlier, letting him hold it with the same care a surgeon gives a newly found instrument. When James touched it, a faint warmth spread under his skin, not unlike the sense he had when performing a successful surgery and feeling the quiet return of life as vessels took on the flow again. He wrote more in his ledger, this time in the margins. Questions to ask Cale. How are you here? What is your purpose? What did you mean by consciousness technologies? Are these the techniques of saints or something else entirely? He underlined the last question and, with the stubbornness of a man trained to keep records, placed the page under the Polaroids.
Cale slept in a folding cot in a back room. At some hour before dawn, James woke to a noise like paper, a soft slide. He went to the doorway and found Cale sitting cross-legged, palms up, eyes closed, a light in the room like a spill of mercury on the floor. James stood there and watched, feeling like a trespasser and a privileged witness. When Cale opened his eyes, he did not look surprised to see James. He seemed to expect the watchful man in the doorway. He spoke once, no more than a breath, but what he placed in James's head then was not a command and not a boast. It was an offer.
"There is danger coming," he thought, and the sentence knifed into the room with a seriousness James did not expect. Not the kind you see in films, the fire and brimstone of prophets, but a slow pressure, a shift of the field, a change in what living things feel and how attention anchors. Sensitivities will rise. Lines between what is felt and what is imagined will blur. Those who are ready to listen and align will shape many outcomes. Those who cling to old certainties may be shaken. The words carried with them images, not full visions, but the impression of a sky thickening like the inside of a bell, and a current that made people's nerves hum at different pitches. James felt it as a manual trembling in his chest, the autoimmune ache pulsing differently, an echo rather than a spike. He also felt a tightening of his throat, because the theological implications demanded a reckoning. He thought of sermons about end times. In sermons, the end was often an event beyond control. Cale's language made it sound like a phase, a wave, a kind of acceleration in which sensitivity itself would be the test. "Danger," Cale said again, with patient insistence. "Not punishment, James. Pressure, opportunity. The tests will be of compassion and attention more than of survival." James could have stopped then. He could have written the night off to a tired mind, to an imaginative stress reaction. He could have called authorities or a university lab and asked them to take Cale away to be studied under controlled conditions. He did not. Instead, he sat down on the cot opposite Cale and said what he had not yet been willing to admit out loud. "If what you say is true, how do we prepare? How do we help without making things worse?" Cale's eyes shone with a light that was not human brightness, but was close enough to be recognized. "You teach people to feel forgiveness," he said. "You teach them how to let love be an active frequency rather than a sentiment. You show them the techniques that move attention and clear patterns. And you teach humility, the kind that refuses to be the savior." James thought of the word forgiveness and let it land in his stomach like a rock. Forgiveness in the clinic had been a private thing before. Soft words murmured over a dying animal, a farmer forgiving himself for a decision that cost a calf's life. He had never considered it as a regular technique, a practiced intervention that could alter physiology. Cale spoke of forgiveness as if it were a surgical skill, precise and teachable. It made James angry and intrigued in equal measure. That night, the town slept, and the clinic hummed with life on a scale James had not anticipated. He was, in the fattest margins of his mind, a man who was both terrified and relieved to be equal parts scientist and witness. He recorded more observations. He took blood samples from the stranger and from himself at Cale's suggestion. Nothing invasive, he told himself, because science requires baselines. He sent some of the vials to Dr. Stevens with instructions to run them blind. Label A as patient 1, label B as control. He also did something he had not done in years. He opened an old shoebox of letters from his ex-wife and read them by lamplight, because Cale's talk of forgiveness had hit a nerve. He read the softer moments, the promises that had eroded not from a single blow, but from the attrition of tiredness and long nights. He read a letter where she had written that sometimes she thought he loved the animals more than her. He folded the letter and placed it under his pillow that night, because the forgiveness Cale described would first have to be practiced in the small chambers of his own heart. On the third day, the stranger, Cale, asked a question that would mark the fulcrum of James's future path. "Do you want to learn?" It was not a trap.
It was not a demand. It was less than a promise and more than an invitation, an opening. James could have said no. He could have enrolled Cale into institutional hands, let the university formalize the evidence, and publish a paper that stripped all wonder from the anecdote. He could have shut the ledger and put the Polaroids away, choosing the safety of the known. But he felt in his chest the steadying line that had appeared when he first placed his hand on Cale's sternum. He thought of Belle getting to her feet. He thought of the knot of clients in the county who trusted him when things were precarious. He thought of a life that had lately been defined by measures and the nagging sense that even the best measures had not been enough. He said yes. Cale's smile then was not human either. It was a rearrangement of features that James read as gratitude. "We start small," Cale transmitted. "We will not promise miracles. We will document. We will keep instruments nearby. We will keep doctors in the loop. The first practices are practical: breath, focus, and a forgiveness exercise that loosens tissue of resentments. Small things. Then we watch." They began in the clinic like two men rehearsing a new technique. Cale guided James through sequences of breath and visualization with clinical precision. Inhale to account, hold for account, release like a valve. The forgiveness practice involved James thinking of people who had wounded him and, in a small step-by-step script Cale offered, releasing the tightness associated with each memory into a symbolic stream of light that moved from chest to earth. The language was gentle and functional, no theology forced on James that he had already owned. He appreciated that. Cale's humility in presenting it as a method. After 10 repetitions, James felt a looseness in his fingers he had not felt in months. He felt fatigue, yes, but also clearer paper between his ribcage like a page bathed in sunlight for the first time. He recorded numbers and subjective sensations, mindful of Richard's admonition. He kept an EMG on his hand later that afternoon and found a small reduction in tremor amplitude. Not a cure, not enough for headlines, but measurable. He breathed and recorded and tasted the possibility of a life less mediated by constant inflammation. Cale rallied his vocabulary around images that felt like math and poetry. He called forgiveness release engineering and unconditional love a frequency. He described ancient teachers, Jesus among them, as practitioners who had taught attention as a tool. He never declared that those teachers were not divine, only that they had methods that could be studied. Many traditions preserved this, he would say. Some taught it as ritual, some made it doctrine. It is the work we preserve, not the labels. James wrestled with that. A Sunday school lesson had been simple: faith, prayer, miracles. Cale suggested technique, training, something replicable. James did not reject faith. He found a way, under the hum of clinical equipment and the soft past of herb-scented hand soap, to hold both ideas at once: that faith carries weight and that practice can shape outcomes. He imagined a clinic where both pills and prayers might be instruments in a bigger tool chest. On the 4th morning, something small occurred that James would later replay like a turning in a film. A calving had gone wrong 2 farms over. A new mother refused her calf and the animal lay cold. It was, by the numbers, a routine emergency. Hypothermia, separation, human intervention required. James and Cale were called because word had spread and because the farmer, Martha Peterson, had seen Belle rise and wanted the same for her newborn. They arrived to find a thin calf cuddled into itself, lungs shallow. Martha, a woman of limited patience but deep care, pressed her hand to the calf's side and sobbed. James took his place, with towels and a heater and a bottle warmed by a bath. He did the work he knew, and alongside him, Cale placed a hand on the calf's flank and cued James in a rhythm of breath that matched the tiny chest's inhale. They did not speak to one another aloud. No words were necessary. They worked as a unit. Here the mechanic of veterinary practice, there the intent-focused touch, while Martha wept with relief when the calf began to suckle. This is anecdote, Dr. Stevens would later remind him in his pragmatic voice, but anecdotes start questions. Keep measuring, keep inviting critique. James kept doing both. He logged the calf's survival,
Bell's incremental improvement, the small fade in his own tremor, and the ledger filled with dates, times, vitals, and odd witness statements that would be the stuff of both an internal report and a local legend. By the time the third day closed, the clinic had become a hub of something that felt like possibility and peril mixed. There were visitors now, neighbors with casseroles, and skeptical colleagues who wanted to look under the lamp.
There were also quiet moments of terrified prayer tucked into the corners, and a woman from the church who came not with judgment, but with candles and a gentle question about whether this was God's work or something else. James could not answer categorically. He could only say, with a steadier voice than he felt, that he had witnessed improvement when attention and standard care were combined, and that he would not advise anyone to forego doctors or medication. At the end of the third day, Cale sat with James and put into his head a phrase that would linger. The world is changing. Attention is the new currency. James tested the sentence like a new coin, turning it under light. He felt the edges, the pragmatic caution of Dr. Stevens, the theological unease he carried from youth, the undeniable hum of the small miracles he'd seen. He also felt, under it all, the ache of a man who had always wanted to be useful on a scale no ledger can prove. When he climbed into his truck that night to check on patients still in the valley, the county road lit by a thin moon, he did something he had not done since the divorce. He called his mother. He told her the blunt facts as he could. There's a stranger in my clinic. He asked her to pray. She laughed and told him to be careful. He told her about Belle getting up. She said the Lord works in strange ways. James hung up and felt a softening he could not properly name. He felt the pull between stories that comfort and stories that challenge. He stopped at the clinic long enough to stand in the doorway and look at Cale sleeping, breathing, still in the small blue light. The ledger lay on the desk with its Polaroids and questions. James turned the page, and under the photograph of the stranger on the exam table, he wrote in capital letters, as if to anchor the entry, "Document, watch, respect." If this story is speaking to you, if the possibility of healing beyond what you've been taught matters, subscribe to Stories from Beyond. There's more ahead. The ledger on James' desk grew weightier with each passing day, its pages swollen with Polaroids, lab slips, and the same cramped handwriting that had once cataloged birthing weights and vaccination schedules. News of Belle and the calf had carried beyond the county. Strangers left quilts on the clinic porch, and a local reporter asked to record a brief statement. The county church bulletin printed a cautious note about prayer requests. Some evenings, James found himself surrounded by people who wanted to touch the thing they had heard about, an odd mixture of hope, curiosity, and a hunger for some explanation that would let them sleep at night. That hunger came in many shapes. At the next Sunday service, the pastor of a nearby church, Reverend Collier, a man with a broad face and a patient manner James had respected since childhood, approached him in the vestibule and rested a hand on his shoulder in a way that implied both friendship and concern.
"Jim," the Reverend said quietly, "people are talking. They want to know if this is from God or something else. Do you understand the trouble this could stir?" James did understand. He thought first of the patients on his board, pregnant cows, elderly collies, a flock of laying hens that kept the Petersons afloat during lean months. He thought of the county fair and the casual reverence people carried for the predictable rhythms of animal life. He also thought of his own mother, who had prayed in the kitchen while turning over casserole pans and believed in explanations that comforted rather than perplexed. "We're seeing improvements when we pair attention practices with standard care," James replied. "I'm documenting it. I'm not saying miracles. I'm not asking anyone to choose faith over medicine, Reverend. I want oversight. I want clarity." Reverend Collier squeezed his hand and then let it go, as if releasing a small plant back to the soil. "Just be careful, Jim. Faith can be twisted by fear, and fear makes people do strange things." The pastor's worry was only one current in the broader flow.
A county health inspector called with a polite but firm set of questions. A pastor from a neighboring town publicly cautioned his congregation to avoid playing with forces we do not understand. And beneath the procedural reminders and cautious conversations, there was an undercurrent of suspicion that something unsettled the predictable social map. Things no longer fit into neat boxes. James felt the pressure. He also felt the ledger's pull toward rigor. He began to build procedures with the same clinical attention he had used on surgical nights. Baselines, blind codes, repeated measures. For every testimony that arrived, he aimed to pin it to a chart. If he could erect a bridge between what Cale taught and the methods he trusted, he reasoned, the risk of being dismissed as illusion would shrink. Dr. Richard Stevens, who had told him to stay methodical, became a regular. He came with syringes and centrifuges, with the kind of skeptical curiosity that demands numbers. The two of them set up a small protocol. Blood draws before and after focused attention sessions, cortisol assays, CRP levels, and EMG traces on James' hand when he performed the breath and focus sequences. They agreed, like two surgeons deciding the margins of a difficult resection, to be ruthless in their documentation. "Whatever this is," Richard said, as they labeled vials in the narrow back office, "we'll run it. If it's placebo, we may learn something about expectation. If it's measurable, if there are consistent changes, we'll have to explain them. We'll write it without hyperbole." Cale watched the bustle with patient interest. He held no instruments, and yet he seemed to move in the clinic with the calm of someone who had practiced restraint his whole life. When Richard took tissue samples from a mare's wound and labeled them A and B, one before, one after a focused session, Cale pointed out, gently, that healing was not merely the absence of inflammation, but the re-establishment of coherent function. "You measure what changes," he transmitted once, in that strange interior cadence, "but remember to measure what matters. Speed without integration leaves scars." The first controlled session they ran in that formal way was hardly dramatic. James sat on a low stool in a quiet room, electrodes attached to his forearm. Richard adjusted the dials and read the baseline numbers aloud. Amplitude, 8.2, frequency, 3.6. Cale sat across from him and placed both hands on his knees, eyes closed. The protocol was brief: a centered breathing routine, a forgiveness script designed by Cale, and a 5-minute presence where James directed attention not toward fixing, but toward witnessing. It was private and clinical in equal measure. The room smelled of coffee, warmed blankets, and the faint metallic tang of the electrodes. When they finished, Richard wrote numbers into a chart, and then, almost shyly, said, "There's a small but reproducible dip in tremor amplitude after these sessions. Nothing miraculous, but consistent." "Small is still movement," James said. He felt both elation and caution in the same breath. He had always been taught that small shifts could accumulate, that the aggregate of tiny improvements could equal life altered. He filed the numbers and then checked his own pulse with a reflexive hand. Still, measurement did not silence the voices that wanted an interpretation. An opinion column in the regional paper framed the events as superstition. A caller on a local radio show demanded the sheriff come and investigate the stranger in the clinic. Some in the community offered prayers and casseroles. Others whispered about charlatans and men with hidden agendas. The most painful pressure came not from headlines or gossip, but from within his own chest. On a cool afternoon, while cataloging blood counts, James opened his shoebox of letters again and read a folded note from his ex-wife. "I thought you loved the animals more than me." It landed like a stone and stayed. Cale noticed, not with pity, but with an observation that felt like a clinical note. "Many healers begin by tending others and forget themselves," he transmitted. "You do not have to rescue everything to be useful." The observation struck a tender, raw place. James knew he had been for years an efficient savior to creatures, but a fumbling partner in relationships. The forgiveness exercises, so mechanistic on the surface, pressed at those old seams like a surgical instrument. Later that week, he scheduled the development he had been avoiding, a session devoted not to Belle or the calf, but to himself. He set aside a morning, closed the clinic to routine visits, and invited Dr. Stevens to observe.
There was no theater in the room, just a charted plan and instruments on the table. James prepped like any patient. He took blood for cortisol, for CRP, and for a panel Richard had suggested might reveal subtle inflammation markers. The numbers were recorded with the dry honesty of lab work. Then he sat and allowed Cale to guide him. "Start with breath," Cale instructed under the hush of their heads. "Anchor to a point behind the sternum. Bring to mind one person at a time who wounded you. See the memory without adding the stories. Name the tightness. Put your hands on it with intention." The forgiveness script was more procedural than sermon. Name, feel, release. James found himself thinking of the long list of small betrayals and silences. A partner's complaint, a father's absence, a friend who had left a door closed. He followed the sequence and imagined each tightness as a pebble and the forgiveness as a small stream that moved each pebble downstream. He did not pretend the memories dissolved. They did not vanish. But he felt the acute edge of them diminish like a sore cooling under salve. At the end of the process, he felt lighter, and there were more concrete markers to test the feeling. Richard ran the blood again. The cortisol level showed a modest drop, not a cure for autoimmune disease, but a measurable physiological response aligned with the subjective sensation of easing. The CRP had also shifted downward by a margin that, while not decisive, suggested decreased inflammatory signaling after the session. Richard's face when he read the numbers was more open than James had seen, curiosity tempered by professional reserve. "Again," he said simply, "repeat it in a week. We'll chart it." The repetition reinforced a pattern. Over the next fortnight, with measures taken before and after sessions, with restless nights recorded and medication regimens logged, James' numbers traced up and down like any clinical variable. Sometimes there was no change. Sometimes the shift was clear. Always the practice was paired with conventional care. He echoed this insistence whenever the conversation turned to claims. Do not abandon your doctors. Use both. Keep measurements. Word of the measurable session spread. A handful of farmers who had been skeptical began to visit with cautious requests. "It's not that I believe," one said, "but if it helps old May get another month, I'm willing to try." A schoolteacher who had suffered chronic pain for years asked if she could learn the breathwork. James agreed, feeling the strange tension of a clinician stepping deeper into pedagogy. Not everyone was willing. A small but vocal contingent accused him of dabbling in superstition. Others warned the church of heresy. The county veterinarian board scheduled a hearing, an ordinary administrative meeting that felt, in James's mind, like a trial. He worried he'd lose his license, or worse, see his reputation erode until no one trusted him with a sick lamb. At night, he woke with his palms cold and reached for the ledger as if for a buoy. In the middle of these waves, a demonstration came that pushed the argument beyond private numbers and into communal witness. It began with a call at dawn. A man named Bill Peterson had collapsed on his porch with a fever, delirious and gray. He was, in the language of the county, a hard man, a veteran farmer with little time for sentiment and less time for idle talk. When James arrived, Bill was sweating and shaking, the color of a man who had been carried to the borders of his strength. They took him inside, ran fluids, and began the standard protocol: paracetamol, assessments, blood draws. The fever hovered high, and his family, standing in the hallway, folded themselves around a hope that had nothing to do with science. Cale knelt by the bedside, closed his eyes, and asked James to place a hand lightly on Bill's shoulder while he guided a short attention practice. This time, it was not just a breath sequence on a chart. Cale spoke something into the room that felt like the compression of 100 small moments. Witness, align the nervous system, deliver compassion without story. James placed his hand on Bill's sternum and felt as if he had opened a valve. The man's breathing, so ragged minutes before, slowed a fraction. His fingers unclenched.
The fever broke over the course of the afternoon with a speed that surprised even the family, moving from a high tide to a slow recession. He slept a long sleep and woke with a clarity that allowed him to crack a joke about the coffee. No one pronounced miracles out loud. The family spoke in halting gratitude and quiet tears. A cousin signed a statement that later joined the ledger. He was not himself. After they sat, he came back to us. Such witness deepened some people's faith and unsettled others. The county veterinarian board, after an hour of probing questions, granted only a narrow rebuke. Maintain clear documentation and do not represent techniques as a substitute for standard care. It was a small reprieve and a reminder that the professional world had its own boundaries. Beneath the community theater of testimony and hearings, Cale continued to teach in measured steps. He favored demonstration under controlled settings and a pedagogy of humility. "We are not saviors," he said once, placing a hand on an exam chart. "We are facilitators of alignment. Attention is not omnipotent. It is a tool that can be misused." He also unfolded a larger picture in ways that unsettled and intrigued James. On a late autumn evening, as the clinic's windows fogged with condensation, Cale shared a transmission that broadened the frame. It was not prophecy in the cinematic sense, the trumpet blast visions of popular apocalypse, but a structural reading of the times. Earth is entering a field of influence, Cale placed in James's mind like a small map unfolded. Not an invasion, a change in relationship. Sensitivities will rise. Systems that were steady will show stress. This is not to frighten, it is to prepare. He spoke of an acceleration in which attention would be premium, not in terms of apocalyptic spectacle, but as a practical reality. Heightened sensitivities, increased psychosomatic presentations, polarized responses to information, and a demand for practitioners who could hold both scientific rigor and compassionate presence. Those who can practice clarity, discernment without dismissal, will be needed as translators, he said. They will be bridges. James's immediate reaction was a blend of skepticism, fear, and an opening that felt like a cracked seed. The framing fit with the pattern he'd been watching, the boom in psychosomatic complaints, the fragile spikes in autoimmune flares, the way people seemed more volatile, more easily wounded by words. But Cale's language carried no triumphalism, it asked for service. "Is this what you mean by end times?" James asked one night, the journal open and the lamp warm beside him. Cale's answer was not a prophetic timetable, but a moral challenge. "End times is a phrase your stories use," he transmitted. "In my languages, it means end of an era. Old frameworks will be tested. Some will wither, some will be reborn. The test is not suffering, but fidelity to compassion under pressure." Even framed with such care, the message pressed on James's theological nerves. He thought of sermons where the end was a cataclysmic event and not a gentle admonition to better loving. He thought of the old certainty that God intervenes in dramatic, unambiguous ways. Cale's perspective suggested a more distributed engagement. Attention as a lever, forgiveness as a practical intervention, love as an energetic frequency that could be learned and practiced. The theological debate did not stay private for long. Reverend Collier arranged a meeting with James and a small group of community leaders. They sat in the church hall, warmed by coffee and the soft decay of hymn books. The conversation was careful but frank. Some wanted assurance that this was not blasphemy. Others wanted reassurance that people would not be misled. James spoke honestly. "I cannot speak for doctrine," he said. "All I can tell you is what I have observed and what I have measured. Cale's methods do not require abandoning our beliefs. They require honesty, discipline, and humility, and they must be paired with proper medical care." Reverend Collier folded his hands and looked at him with the look of a man weighing his parish's soul. "If this is to be part of our life," the Reverend said slowly, "it must be tempered with worship. Any practice that helps people toward God is worth exploring cautiously. But we must not forget our doctrinal anchors." The debate settled into an uneasy compromise that allowed James to continue his work under the watchful eye of both the church and the medical board. It was an uneasy partnership, but it was partnership nonetheless. Cale's teachings broadened in scope and subtlety with time,
He worked with children who had anxiety toward loud storms by teaching a simplified attention practice that grounded them in their breath and their small bodies. He guided a woman with chronic digestive pain through a sequence of forgiveness and nutritional realignment that, in her telling, offered a new framework for understanding her suffering. Each account was paired with standard care, a dietitian for the woman, pediatric consultation for the children. James insisted on the conjunction of treatments. At the same time, the world beyond Cedar Falls pressed inward. A researcher from a university contacted James about the dataset he'd been compiling. An invitation to speak at a small integrative health symposium arrived, the kind of platform that balanced academic caution with curiosity. James felt the tug of possibility and the familiar tug of fear. It was near one of those crossroads that Cale's decision to leave came. He had said from the start that he traveled and taught in small doses, that his presence here had been a brief alignment rather than a permanent graft. And yet, when the moment arrived, the departure felt abrupt. The morning he left the clinic was clear and cold. Frost edged the truck windows, and the sun made the troughs of the fields sparkle like a scattering of tiny coins. Cale stood by the open door of the clinic, his coin-like object in his hand. James had prepped for a marketable goodbye, farewells, a ledger update, a plan to continue the practices. But the farewell was quieter than ceremony. "You will go on," Cale transmitted, offering both prediction and injunction. "You will be tested. There will be moments when it is easier to return to what is comfortable. Hold fast to measurement. Hold fast to humility. Teach those who are ready. Let those who are not go with peace." He did not speak of dramatic futures or cataclysmic ends. He framed the coming pressure as a wave of sensitivity. The field arrives like weather. Some will sense it more. Some will call it spiritual. Some will think it madness. The work is to hold care and evidence side by side. He left James with the small coin and a folded sequence of exercises written in a hand that was, to James's eye, elegantly spare. Cale's absence left a physical hollow in the clinic, but a fermenting kind of energy as well. James found himself waking early, reading the script aloud, and then doing the work as a discipline rather than a miracle. He taught a few neighbors in a spare exam room, and those people taught others. The language of the practice, the breath counts, the forgiveness mapped as movement, moved into common speech. People described dropping a pebble into the stream or clearing the chest. Cale continued to reach James sometimes with transmissions that arrived at odd hours. A thought of encouragement, a metaphor that opened a stubborn knot, a reminder to keep measures.
James sometimes wondered whether he would see Cale again. He also wondered whether he needed to. The work was moving from being a private experiment into a public vocation. As months passed, the clinic shapeshifted. The fluorescent signs still hummed. Animals continued to be brought in with sprains and births and the ordinary cruelties of farm life. But alongside suture sets and antibiotics sat notebooks with attention scripts. There was a room set aside for quiet practice, its walls painted a soft, forgiving blue. A sign on the door read, in James' neat hand, "Bridge work, breath plus care." A few clients, skeptical at first, wrote notes of gratitude that James kept under a clip on the board. "My back," said one. "My son's panic attacks," read another. None of them spoke in absolutes. All of them insisted that something modest but real had shifted. The work drew close allies and stubborn critics. Dr. Stevens, who had come as a skeptical ally, became something closer to a collaborator. He published a small pilot report with careful language that emphasized anecdotal nature but suggested statistically significant short-term changes in inflammatory markers in a subset of participants after practice sessions, results that opened conversations rather than closed them. For Richard, the work was both a professional curiosity and a moral exercise in humility. He remained careful with language and rigorous with method, but he also began, after a long winter of data and nights at the hospital, to sit in the quiet room and practice the breath sequence. A turning point came during a community fair one warm spring afternoon when a woman James had treated for chronic autoimmune pain spoke on a modest stage.
She stood with a microphone and told a room full of people about a practice that had changed how she woke each morning. She did not shout miracles. She spoke of small windows, mornings when pain was quieter, of the joy of picking herbs again, of being able to lift her grandchild without fear. Her testimony was personal and unpolished. It held no demand that anyone else accept her experience. The crowd listened with a silence that felt like a field waiting for seed. Not all seeds sprouted, but enough did. A handful of local practitioners, nurses, a chiropractor, a folk herbalist, began to bring patients to the clinic, curious about combining routines they already used with James' practices. James taught them small sequences and stressed that the work was not exclusive to any belief system. "We never tell people to drop their medical regimens," he would say. "We add tools. We track. We stay honest."
With the rise in interest, James also found himself recruited into conversations he had never expected. Panels about integrative medicine, quiet backroom talks with a university anthropologist curious about the social dynamics of healing in rural America, and an invitation to train a small cohort of clinicians who wanted to learn the attention practices in a structured way. He insisted on a curriculum that mixed technical rigor with spiritual humility. Readings on nervous system regulation, lab-based assessment techniques, and guided practice of the attention sequences. Through all of this, the question of Jesus, of theological claims, hung like a persistent knot. Cale had suggested that Jesus' acts might be read as demonstrations of attention's power, a consciousness technology rather than a reductionist denial of divinity. James held that idea as a lens, not a doctrine. He found himself in long conversations with Reverend Collier and with other local clergy, who read Cale's framing as provocative. In those dialogues, James learned to translate. He spoke of attention as a tool, and of Jesus as an exemplar of compassion, whose teachings included techniques for aligning heart and intention. He stressed that what he had learned did not require anyone to abandon liturgy or creeds. Rather, it required humility in interpretation. The longer arc of his life shifted in quieter ways. His autoimmune flares became less frequent, measured, documented, not miraculous. He still took medication. He still maintained the rituals of a clinic: sterilize, suture, fuss over feed schedules. But his nights were no longer entirely bereft. Once, when a particularly sharp flare threatened his grip, he sat with the forgiveness script and a photograph of his ex-wife. He said the words out loud, and for the first time in years felt the level of inflammation recede into a background murmur rather than a scream. The EMG recorded a fall in tremor amplitude that matched his perception of steadiness. He did not mistake that for proof of ultimate healing. He celebrated it as one more data point in a life of practice. As the years moved forward, Cedar Falls itself changed in small ways. People who had once defined themselves only by hard labor found new language to speak about inner states and resilience. The clinic doors that had once opened only to surgical lights and anxious farmers now welcomed hesitant newcomers seeking guidance in both medical and attention-based practices. James trained a small cohort of bridge practitioners, nurses and technicians who learned the sequences and carried them out under supervision. They maintained meticulous charts and met monthly with a review board that included Reverend Collier and Dr. Stevens. The board's presence lent the work a modest authority and a check against the excesses that the community feared. Cale's influence threaded through these developments like a river under stone.
He visited again only twice, arrivals that were as unceremonious as his departure had been. Each time he taught new sequences, refined language, and cautioned about hubris. Once he sat with James in late autumn and said, "Teach the humility as loudly as the technique. The tests you will face are not only physiological." Toward the end of his life, James came to understand his vocation not as a savior, but as a translator. The clinic remained a place of stitching, skin to skin, data to story, breath to chart.
He published notes that were careful in tone, insisting always on the conjunction of conventional medicine and attention practices. He never offered absolutes. He always cautioned against abandoning medical care. He required informed consent for every participant in a practice session and insisted on follow-ups. When he grew older, years after the night behind the hay bales, he sat in the clinic's quiet room and read through the ledger, now thick with decades. There were children he'd taught to breathe through storms and old farmers who had found a better night's sleep. There were a few people whose stories read like miracles, and others where nothing had changed. He kept the ledger because it told the truth of his work, mixed, messy, hopeful, and careful. He never stopped being moved by the memory of Cale's final transmission about the world changing. He framed it always as perspective rather than prophecy. The end times he described had been, for James, less about catastrophic finality and more about threshold. Old certainties dissolving, new sensitivities rising, and a role of healers shifting from rescuers to bridge builders. He believed, with the cautious conviction of a clinician who had seen bleeding stop and moods shift, that compassion practiced with discipline could alter the probabilities people faced. On an evening in which the sky hung low and the clinic sign hummed against a thin rain, James made an entry in his final ledger. No archive, no announcement, just a quiet record meant for whoever would read this and think about their hands. He wrote, "The work is not a replacement for medicine. It is a companion. We measure. We keep doctors in the loop. We ask for oversight and we give evidence. We do not promise cures to those who listen. We teach practices that reduce tightness and help people live with more breath. We ask the world to meet us halfway." The last paragraphs of his ledger were not triumphal. They were invitation. He noted the names of the small cadre he had trained, the towns where they had begun modest classes, and the few randomized protocols he'd managed to organize with Dr. Stevens' reluctant help. He closed the book with a hand that had steadied after years of therapy, practice, and discipline. 1 week later, at a small gathering in the clinic, no fans, no cameras, people shared stories. A woman with a scar on her forearm told how she could lift her toddler without fear. A high school teacher said she had found peace in the tide of adolescent anxieties. The crowd was ordinary and extraordinary at once: farmers, nurses, clergy, curious neighbors. They did not demand a new theology. They wanted tools and time. They left with recipes for breath sequences, with slips of paper that described the forgiveness script in simple steps. James stood at the doorway as they left, the coin Cale had given him warm in his pocket even now. He felt gratitude like a tide and returned to the ledger. He could have published grand claims. He had chosen instead to let the work speak in measured results and human stories. He had honored the professional boundaries of his training and the deeper stirrings of a life lived in attention. He also kept a caution in the narrative, one he repeated whenever the subject turned toward the miraculous. In the clinic handbook, in the small print of community flyers, and in private conversations, he made this clear. These practices are not a substitute for conventional medical care. If you are ill, seek your doctors. Use these techniques as companions. Do not give up your medicines for a promise. Measure, be accountable. In the years that followed, the phrase consciousness tools entered the local lexicon, not as dogma, but as a descriptor for a set of practices and an ethic of attention. The era that Cale had described did not erupt into cinematic apocalypse. It arrived incrementally, through spikes of sensitivity, through polarized arguments on social media, through a public that demanded both evidence and sanity. James' little clinic found a place in that landscape as a small bridge, careful, documented, and insistently humble. When he closed the ledger for the last time and placed it on the shelf alongside the Polaroids, the town outside continued to breathe and farm in its complicated ways. Belle passed peacefully some years later. The family mourned and celebrated the seasons. Bill Peterson lived long enough to tell the story of the afternoon when he woke from a fever that had brought him close. Dr. Stevens moved to a research post and kept in touch with cautious, precise updates. Cale, wherever he was in the wide weave of things, remained in James' memories as a teacher whose presence reshaped what it meant to be a healer in a small American town. James sometimes wrote in his diary not as a clinician, but as a man who had been taught both stitches and forgiveness. He wrote, "I do not know everything. I know that attention matters. I know that compassion practiced with discipline changes bodies and hearts in ways we can sometimes measure and sometimes only feel. I know that we are entering years that will test our ability to love under pressure. If we meet that test with humility and evidence, we may yet reshape what end times means, a closing of old books and the opening of new work to care better for one another."
If this resonates with you, if you have seen healing that defies simple explanation, or if you carry a question about how to marry faith and medicine, share your experience below. Tell us what has helped you breathe easier. And subscribe if you want to hear more stories of people who learned to bridge the ordinary and the extraordinary.